everyone, and welcome to another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers with me, Murray, your weekly fix of 10 minutes or more or less of me ranting and raving about ancient warfare to take you away from whatever's happening in your everyday life and the world. Think about Roman or Greek or ancient warfare. And what I do here is I attempt to answer the question from a reader, viewer, or listener. This question coming up from Seth is one of these new ways of finding me. And of course, you can ask us a question. You can send me a postcard or a letter. You can send an email, AWA415.com. You can comment on a previous video or podcast. You can send a message. You can post on Facebook. You can track me down by my name on Messenger and send a message, which is what Seth has done. You can, of course, back us on Patreon, one of three different levels: Legionary, Optio, and Centurion. Seth sent me a message on Messenger and so says to me, "Hi Murray, really appreciate your AWA podcast. Great short bursts of knowledge." Thank you, Seth. One question that bugs me about legionaries. Why did the Romans completely abandon the spear in favour of the pilum? Does it function effectively as a thrusting weapon as well as a thrown weapon? If you have space for a 2-4, do you have time to talk about the comparative effectiveness of slings versus bows in the classical world? When did slings drop out of use in organised warfare? That's probably 3, but you've made the mistake of being highly accessible. The mistake, oh, thanks. And willing to take a crack at all sorts of topics. Indeed. Foolish man that I am. Okay. So there's a really interesting conceit that goes on with the pilum and the idea that one of the fascinating things about the Roman legionary is that they are a swordsman, and their javelins, whether you use spicula, iaculum, or pilum, they throw them first and then they engage in hand-to-hand melee with their sword, whether it be a spatha or a gladius. And so, unlike we see in films where they advance to stab with very slender-necked pila, that's not how a pilum is designed. A pilum is designed to be thrown. Whether you agree with the idea that there's a wooden peg that they're meant to bend in the enemy shield and not be able to be thrown back, I leave up to you. The interesting thing about that, though, is a lot of pila, when they're discovered, are not bent. Some are, absolutely, but some are straight. And you're like, well, that one didn't bend when it hit. And so the idea is that you throw this weapon probably to disrupt the enemy, whether through injury or striking their shields, and then you engage. So the actual distance from which you are throwing isn't vast. It's not a great distance. It's as you move in. The only film, as far as I know, that does show that is the 1936 Scipio Africanus film, where they throw javelins at one another, which looks very, very dangerous. But of course, it was 1936, a different time in terms of OH&S and safety standards. The fascinating thing is that there are, of course, different types of javelin. There are light javelins and there are heavier javelins, which have a thicker shaft. And so possibly they could be used. Obviously, in the earlier Manipular Legion, as opposed to the Cohortal Legion around the time of Caius Marius, 107 BC is when it's generally dated. But we don't tend to credit Marius with those reforms anymore. But there is a transition between the Manipular and the Cohortal Legion. That's a different question entirely. The idea, of course, is that earlier, when you had the Hastati, Principes, and Triarii, the Triarii have spears, hasta. Confusingly, the Hastati don't have hasta spears, they have pila, javelins. And also confusingly, of course, the Hastati before the Principes, even though Principes means first. Oh, messy. Anyway, the interesting thing is that there is a combination of javelins and spears in that. And I think, although the Roman weapon becomes identified as the pila, the pilum is the Roman weapon, more than the gladius, actually, or the ensis, which is a more generic term for sword. The sort of identifier when they talk about us versus them is the pilum versus the sagitta versus the arrow, or the pilum versus the ensis, the sword for the Celts and things like that. And so it's their weapon of identity, if you like. And that, I think, overtakes the reality of there are always a combination of javelins and spears. When we look at Marcus Aurelius's column, the legionaries on that column have spears, and there are various other monuments where the legionaries have hasta spears, thrusting spears, rather than throwing javelins. There are, of course, lots of depictions of throwing javelins as well in tombstones and other reliefs of legionaries, but there are also ones where they have thrusting spears. And so I think it's a far more expedient idea that the Roman army would choose a particular weapon in a particular campaign, depending on what was going to be advantageous to them, or there's going to be a generalized mix of weapons, which is kind of the whole point of the Roman legionary, with both a throwing pilum and a stabbing sword. And so the idea that they would have thrusting spears as an option, with some of the men armed in such a way, is entirely plausible. And so I think this idea of the uniformity of arms is something that really bugs not just talk about helmet types and armor types, but weapon types too. And so I think there's probably far more variety of weapons in Roman legions than there is uniformity. And that's something that we tend to be bogged down with uniformity in terms of them all looking the same. Not helped by 19th century scholarship, and not helped by things like Trajan's column and Marcus Aurelius' column, because there they are shown uniformly. And I think the variety of equipment would be far greater, such as what is shown to us in the archaeological record, where, no two sets of armor are the same, no two helmets are the same. And yet when you look at these archaeological reliefs and things like, when you look at these artistic reliefs, they are the same. And I just don't believe that they were in practicality the same. So, comparative effectiveness of slings versus bows. I think I have talked about this before, but we're well into the 200s now, so I can't remember which one it was. I believe, and we talked in the last one about Vegetius talking about how late Roman legionaries, late 4th, early 5th century, should be trained as slingers and throwing plumbata, the weighted lead dart. For me, it's probably a rate of fire thing, although I think there are some modern slingers out there who talk about how quickly you can fire off sling bullets or stones. But I think it's also about the density of space, that you actually need less room as an archer unit than you do as a slinger unit. You need space around you to fire a sling effectively. And so the number of men in a certain area is less for slingers than it is for archers. And so therefore, perhaps the idea of slingers taking up too much room or being a point of vulnerability, which of course is the idea if they are by themselves on the flanks, for instance, as opposed to behind the legions and firing over their heads, when that counts not only for slingers but for archers too. So I think it's about that. When did slings drop out of use in organised warfare? Well, of course, there'll be people to say that slings are still with us. There's evidence of slings being used in the medieval period. And again, that Vegetius passage tells us that slinging is being used into the 5th century. But again, when we start to read the accounts of battles in that period, we're not getting mention of slingers. And so just because they're not mentioned in those accounts, which don't tend to go into that kind of detail anyway, that's the kind of thing we get in the 1st century AD, a little bit in the 2nd century AD, but then it sort of goes quiet. It doesn't mean that those weapons are not being used. It's just that they don't make it into the battle accounts. So I think that they probably are used at all periods, but they're not the weapon of prestige, and that comes back to the idea of the pila. The pila is the prestige weapon, even if you're using a hasta, even if you're using your sword, and even though Roman legionary tombstones can have pila, but they always have the military belt and generally the sword, even if they don't have the armor or the helmet, for instance. So the identifier of a Roman legionary tends to be the swordsman, but we do get, obviously, a lot of them have their pila as well. But we do have some hasta in some of those tombstones. So just to reinforce that there was a much more expedient variety of weapons rather than it was this weapon and nothing else. I hope, Seth, that answers your question, and you can join me again for another episode of Ancient Warfare Answers. Thanks. Bye.